that's just where it is, just quickly, so you can go in and check those settings. So moving on to conditional access. Conditional access, like I said before, is the ability to set policies at a tenant level to review every authentication attempt that comes into your tenant and see if it meets, and if it meets the criteria of that policy, it'll can apply certain controls. So they'll make more sense to go through them. Again, split them out into sort of policies that we think can be done a lot quicker. They can be implemented quite quickly and increase your security posture massively without impacting users too much. And then we've got at the bottom a few which might require a little bit more planning and take a little bit more time to actually roll them out. So starting off with something we touched on before, rather than sort of relying on your administrators to manually enable MFA, you can configure a conditional access policy that would make sure every time an admin authenticates or logs in with an account that's got any administrative role, it would basically ask them to provide a second factor of authentication, text message, authenticator app, that sort of thing. But the beauty of conditional access, again, is that it's not manually enabled at a user level. It's a tenant level based on the user role, so it would always apply. We'd recommend then you configuring that policy. This is where our document, which I'll show you shortly, comes in, which we will send you, because it will show you all of the sort of the low level design and the precise settings to make these policies actually work in the portal. So you can go in the portal, every setting that a policy needs to be set up is in the document that we're going to send you as well. So if you did want to do some of this work yourself, by all means, you can crack on and use that document to do that. What the policy then do then as well is you can actually configure exceptions, and for this particular one, to make sure you don't get locked out of your own tenant in the event you don't have your second factor authentication, then we'd recommend you create some exceptions in that policy for your break glass accounts. So you can use them to get in if you did ever get locked out. But again, break glass accounts we need to make sure they've got extremely complex passwords in place. The second one, very similar, so touch on that quickly, and it would force any connections to the Azure Management Console either through the web portal, through PowerShell, or through the command line or graph interface to also use MFA, so it would just do that by default. Third is to block legacy authentication. So legacy authentication is allowed is allowed in the tenants, and blocking that will hugely improve your security posture straight away. I think from the Microsoft sort of research on this, I think 97% of breaches that happen are actually via legacy authentication protocols. And the other statistic on this as well was from Microsoft, but I think this is 67% of tenants, tenants that block legacy authentication via conditional access have a 67% less chance of being breached. So the huge numbers there with a fairly sort of small change. If you do have a requirement for legacy authentication for some applications, again, use exceptions. So block legacy authentication for everything, and then allow through them particular accounts that you might need legacy authentication to work still for, or even IP addresses if it's like a server application of some sort with an IP. Allow the IP through, block everything else. Again, in the document, it'll tell you, it'll detail that exact policy and how to implement that. Requiring MFA for guests and external users, for me, I think this is really important, because guest users, you have less control or less interaction with them in terms of being able to train them, make expectations clear around security in your organization and sort of training, and you don't know who's passing credentials around outside of your business in particular. So ensuring MFA is forced for all guests and external users is a really handy policy to implement, and also putting some terms of use. So the first time a guest accesses your tenant, they have to agree to your specific terms of use, which is always useful in the event of a data breach. So that's the sort of ones that we think there's a little bit of impact for those, but the impact is reasonably small. You know, you can get those implemented reasonably quickly. In terms of things that would need a little more planning, because you need users to get onboard devices, that sort of thing, we've got a few more policies, but they are still, well, as far as when we work with customers and do managed services for them, These are still mandatory policies that we have in place for all of our customers. And what those are is, the first one is require approved apps on mobile devices. So that's basically apps that we have control of, so apps that are protected by an application control policy, which we'll come to later, on a mobile device, which basically means that we can set some restrictions on those apps. So we can say people can't copy data from OneDrive on their phone to their Gmail or their Google Drive, that sort of stuff. We can wipe those devices, sorry, we can wipe those apps, not the devices, on those mobiles as well. So if people aren't using an app that we have that control over, it won't let them use that application, basically. That's what that conditional access policy will do. The other policy we think you should put in place, or we put in place, and it really improves security, is MFA, to basically request MFA or block any non-compliant devices. And we'll touch on compliance a little bit later, but what that basically means is you can set up compliance policies as an endpoint manager to assess your devices against your security baseline criteria, which might be the device has to be used in a certain patch level of Windows, it might have to be BitLockered, it might have to be running antivirus, that sort of thing. It might have to be joined to your domain. If it meets those criteria and it's deemed compliant, it will allow the device into your tenant without any MFA, or it won't be blocked, basically. It'll allow the device in. If the device is deemed non-compliant, it doesn't meet the criteria you've set out, then we have two options in the policy. We can either tell the policy to force the user to be MFA'd, so you can make sure it is them, and it's not some sort of brute force attack or like a password spraying attack. But some organisations opt for, if it's not one of our devices, if it's not a compliant device, we don't want it in our tenant at all, so they've got ultimate control. Just depends on the sort of information security policies of that particular organisation in terms of which of those they choose. But one of those is definitely a good idea to put in place. Require an exchange active sync policy on mobile devices. It's a secure protocol. Make sure that exchange is using active sync, basically, and not some sort of third-party apps or third-party protocols to interface with exchange. And then the last one might be something that people aren't fully aware of. So there's this security registration process, which is effectively, if you're using self-service password reset or multi-factor authentication, when a user's first set up for either of those services, they need to register other methods of authentication, such as email, or like an alternate email, a mobile number, the Authenticator app, and they need to enroll into those services initially and provide that information. Now, if you think about, you've set up a new user, but they haven't enrolled into MFA yet, or they haven't logged in yet, somebody else or a brute force could technically enroll that user if they're actually logged into that account first. So what you can do is you can secure that registration process, and basically say that any sort of enrollment, such for MFA or self-service password reset, can only happen from a particular location in terms of IP address, or you can provide the user with, or the user can log in with a temporary password. You give them a temporary code for them to do that enrollment first. And obviously, only they would have that code because you have to provide them with that. So that conditional access policy enforces that, basically. So when we send you over the document, I'm just going to quickly show you the document now. You'll see there's a section on conditional access policies, and it's got all of the recommended details to implement these policies, basically. So you can actually use the document to implement them if you wish to. So this is the a section of the document we're going to send over to you. It's quite a big, detailed document. But if you go in here, we've got a conditional access section. And you can see here, this document details exactly the policies we've been discussing there. So, for example, blocking legacy authentication, all of the details on here, such as assignments, access controls, these are the exact options you'll see in the portal when you go to configure conditional access, and you can use this document as a reference to get these policies up and running. And each of them that we've went through there are all detailed in here.